out there. So with that, I'm Christian Stevenson with the Mississippi State University Extension Service here in Hancock County, joining you by Zoom, by YouTube if you're watching the recording of this. Appreciate you being here and participating in this presentation. If you are watching by YouTube or by video and you would like to ask a question, obviously it's not live, so I can't respond right away, but if you put a question down in the comment section of the video, I will be happy to respond to that and get you an answer as soon as I get the little message that you put a comment there. So I'm happy to do that and would certainly like to help you out. So as I mentioned, this is very much an introduction to roses. This is a topic that has a lot of depth to it. There's so many different varieties of roses and applications for roses in the landscape that it's something we could really spend quite a lot of time on. So my goal today is to kind of run through the different kinds of roses very, very briefly in the hopes that the people who are really good at this don't get too mad at me as I kind of gloss over that. And I also want to talk about planting them and maintaining them in the landscape, spend a little bit of time on pruning. And I'm also going to talk about some of the common insect pests and diseases that you may see on your roses in your landscape and how to take care of that. So roses are a really broad group of plants. They are native all the way across the Northern Hemisphere. So everywhere from North America to Europe to Asia, all have native roses that you can find. And they have been cultivated for a very long time in China and Persia. Ancient Greece and Roman cultures all had rose cultivars that they grew. And there was a lot of trade of those different cultivars or varieties of roses, which really gives us the foundation for all of the vast numbers of varieties that are available today. There are wonderful rose gardens all over the place. I'm going to talk about that just a little bit at the end. And that's led to a lot of natural crosses as well as intentional crosses or breeding that has been done over a very, very long period of time to select for roses that have the particular characteristics that we want. And when we talk about roses, there are, as I mentioned, quite a large number of types of roses, and we can broadly group those into three big categories. The first of those are going to be the species roses. And then we get to the old garden roses and to the modern roses. I'm going to talk just a little bit about each of those groups. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail with the modern roses, both because it's just a little bit more familiar to me and there's a little bit more clear division in those types. When we talk about a species rose, roses are in the genus Rosa. So all of them are essentially what we would think of as a wild rose, or uncultivated or not intentionally bred to have those qualities. And as I mentioned, they occur all over the world, from North America, Europe, everywhere. And generally speaking, when we look at these species roses, they are single-petaled. They tend to bloom one time a year rather than being reblooming like some of our cultivars. And they can vary extraordinarily broadly in their size, everywhere from 2 feet to 20 feet. They may have a bush habit. They may be climbing roses, all sorts of variety there. And when we talk about them, we're generally talking about them according to their scientific name or sort of the common name that goes along with that. So just for 3 examples of the many varieties that are out there, there's R. Banksiae or Lutea, which are the Lady Banks roses or the yellow Lady Banks roses, tend to bloom in late winter. Have a bloom cycle that lasts about 3 or 4 weeks. And you can see an example of that in the top picture here on this slide. And then there's the Gallica roses, or Rosa gallica, also called the apothecary's rose. Have a very strong aroma to them. And they were popular with apothecaries, which is where they get that common name. Tend to be very drought tolerant, very insect resistant. And you can see a picture of an example of those. And keep in mind that there are many different varieties, or there's a broad variation within these there in that middle picture. And I picked that variegated one because I think it looks pretty. And of course, if you're down here in South Mississippi, you'll be familiar with the Cherokee rose, which we often find, growing along roadsides. And that's actually a plant that's native to Asia. So it's not something that's native here, but it is commonly found growing. It's the state flower of Georgia, amongst other things, and has just really wonderful, very large flowers, flowers very prolifically, though it is considered an invasive in some areas. So it can be a nuisance just because it does tend to grow up trees and other things. So we also have the old garden roses, or the heritage roses, or heirloom roses. And really they're classified as just the varieties that existed before 1867. Again, there's a broad variety of growth habit here, but they do, as a group, tend to be very hardy and very resistant to diseases and insects, which make them great for applications in the landscape. They often do have a very strong fragrance. And you can, the majority of them are just spring blooming. You don't tend to see a lot of repeated blooming for these old garden roses, but there are some examples where they do. So some of the spring blooming old roses, damasks and albas, mosses, those spring blooming varieties bloom on old wood. So it's important when we think about those spring blooming varieties that we're going to prune them a little bit different. We'll talk about that just a little bit. But if you prune them in winter and early spring, if you remove that old wood, they're not going to bloom very much because they bloom on that 1-year-old wood. There are some repeated varieties, things like China tea and Portland, hybrid perpetual roses. These are, again, just old varieties. We can prune those much as we would prune other roses in our landscape. And again, pictures here, for example, one of the advantages of doing a presentation about roses is that all of my slides get to have really nice pictures on them. All right, then we get into our modern rose variety, and these are going to be some names that I'm certain you've heard very frequently. Our hybrid tea roses, tend to be a narrow, upright shrub, really well suited for formal gardens. Usually have double flowers with spiraling petals, really nice high center. Develop their single blooms right at the end of a long stem, which makes them really great for me because I like to cut flowers and take them into my wife and make her smile. And you do get repeated blooms in cycles throughout the growing season. And the top picture there is an example. There's the polyantha roses, tend to have a small shrub size that makes them really good for mass plantings or for border plantings. They're the hybrid musk roses. They develop large shrubs. They have sprays of smaller flowers and rebloom very well. We also have rugosa roses. Very good for the landscape, very dense growth form, kind of a deeply veined leaves. And again, one that's going to bloom repeatedly. Floribunda, one that we do run into very often. Again, they have those sprays of flowers. Individual flowers kind of look like a hybrid tea flower, but they require a little bit less effort to maintain in the landscape. And then, of course, you have the grandiflora roses, look a little bit like hybrid teas, tend to bloom singly or in small groups right at the end of a long stem. Another one that I really enjoy. We have the shrub roses. There's all sorts of different kinds of these. Can be small or large. They can have all sorts of different growth habits, all sorts of different flowering habits, often bloom in repeating cycles. One thing that is interesting about these, some people do use rose hips in cooking. Of course, the flower is going to eventually produce the fruit, and for roses, that is a rose hip. And on these, you can get a good rose hip, which can be kind of another attractive feature for the plant. And in some cases, you can train these onto supports. Now, my favorite group of roses are the climbing roses. I just really like the look of roses growing up on trellises. I'm not going to go too deeply into each of all of these different kinds of climbing roses. Obviously, we're going to put those onto a trellis or an arbor. And generally, a lot of the climbing varieties are very similar to sort of the bush form within the same type. So you may have a cultivar that's just named a climbing version of some more common bush cultivar. Sometimes you don't get them to bloom as continually as you might on the parent shrub, but there's a lot of really good variety in this in terms of color, and just some really beautiful applications for these in the landscape. Of course, we can continue on. I think this is our last one for different kinds of roses. Miniature roses are great. The picture up in the top left there is actually a miniature rose. They tend to have very small flowers and a very small plant. Often the maximum height is just 1 foot tall. So they work really well as etching, and I think they work fantastically as patio roses or container plants because of that compact growth habit, and they do put on a fantastic amount of flowers. Another great one are tree roses. They've been grafted onto a rootstock that forms an upright trunk. So you get that slender trunk that doesn't have any leaves or anything on it, and then that sort of dense canopy up at the top with a profusion of flowers that I think really looks great in the landscape. Really works well as a specimen out there, and for areas where you might want to border or you might need ground cover, you also have options for roses there with plants that are going to be low growing and spreading. Work really well on slopes or along walls, and they just produce long canes that creep along the ground, produce flowers off of there. So that leads us to, how do we use roses in the landscape? And there's just such a broad variety of ways that we can do this. We can have specimen plants. That's going to be the rose bush that's out by itself, really kind of being the main feature there, just working really well in our landscape. They also work well as foundation plants, so planted along the borders of the structure on the property, the house. We can have trellises and arbors, or grow them along fences. We can build hedges out of our rose bushes. We can use them as ground covers and as container plants. So really, if there is a way that you can use an ornamental plant in the home landscape, you can find a rose that is going to be really well suited to that use. So now I want to talk a little bit about the culture of roses, how we want to grow them. And we do have to pay attention to site selection. We want to make sure that we get those plants started off in the best conditions that they can, so that we can make sure that they thrive, they grow well, and flower well in our landscape. Roses as group are really full sun plants. As I have mentioned before, when we say full sun, oftentimes, we think, well, the sun comes up at 6 in the morning and goes down at 8, and it needs to have sun on it that whole time. And whoever came up with that term full sun, I don't think they lived in the southeastern United States. So what we're looking at is a minimum of 6 hours, preferably 8 to 10 hours of sun as being sort of the ideal location for them in the landscape. A little bit of shade in the afternoon when the temperatures are really high is actually going to be a little bit beneficial. So, if they get a little bit of shade in that later part of the day, that is perfectly all right. It is a good idea, if you don't want to plant roses right up against something, but in an area where they might get a little bit of shelter from cold and wind that can protect the plants. So if you have a windbreak, planting them near that is always a good way to approach that. Very similar to other plants where we might want to look at having some cold protection. If we have lower areas in the landscape, if our landscape's not completely level, can't imagine very many of them that are, you want to avoid as best we can low-lying areas. Those low-lying areas tend to be cold spots in the landscape. We all know, cold air sinks and hot air rises. So that cold air is going to sink down into those lower spots in the landscape, and that may lead to sort of the plant having more propensity for being cold damaged. We don't want to plant roses as a rule under trees. That's just that's going to lead to them being shaded a lot more frequently. So they're not really great for that application as a planting around the base of trees. And we do want to make sure that the place where we're planting them has good drainage. Like a lot of our plants, roses don't like to have wet feet. They don't tolerate those wet conditions very well. It can make them a lot more prone to getting root rots, and that's a very difficult problem to deal with. So making sure you have good drainage. If you have an area with a really heavy clay soil, as I've mentioned for some of the other plants that we deal with, raising them up, putting them in raised beds, or just giving them a little bit of a berm to grow on can be really beneficial as a way to prevent that excess water from being a problem for the plants. Plant spacing is going to be very dependent on the type of plant that we're talking about. Roses vary broadly in how large that plant's going to be. So just kind of vaguely speaking or approaching that kind of very broadly, we want to make sure we're providing enough space for that plant to have good air movement through its canopy and to be able to get around the plant as well. Being able to access the plant helps us with making sure that if there are any insects or problems like that, roses are going to need pruning. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. So being able to access that plant, not having them all grouped up together too closely is going to be important. So those large shrubs, it could be anywhere from 6 to 15 feet. Hybrid tea plants, maybe 5 or 6. Massed roses, 3 or 4 feet. Miniature roses can be planted very close together. So they do very well in groupings. They only need about a foot between them. And then climbing plants really do need quite a bit of room. So you want to make sure you put about 10 feet between them. And that's just, again, going to ensure that you have enough space for those plants to grow, take up the space that they're going to need in the landscape. So planting roses is going to be very much like planting any other of our plants in the home landscape. Generally speaking, we want to plant in late winter to early spring. So, February into early March. And you can purchase roses one of two ways. You can purchase them as container plants, or you can purchase them as bare root plants. And you're going to want to approach planting them a little bit differently on that. Container plants, if you've planted other container plants, very similar. Just dig a hole. A lot of the directions will say dig a hole the same size as the container you purchased. I'm going to tell you to dig the hole twice as big. I've said this. I think I said this in our last talk that I think you should put a 50-cent plant in a $5 hole. So we're investing some money in these plants. We want to make sure they do well. Preparing a larger hole for them is a great start to that. So I try to make those holes that I put plants in a little bit kind of extra large. That really lets that soil be broken up and be amenable to the plant I'm putting in it. Just make sure, when you put that container plant in the ground, make sure it's not root bound. Check its roots. If there are any broken roots or anything like that, you do want to trim those away. And put that container plant in the ground, just level with the soil or slightly above it, because it will settle just a little bit. What we want to avoid is putting that plant in the ground too low where it's going to settle into a depression. That's going to allow water to stand in that area. And most of our roses are going to be grafted. So look for that graft scar on the base of the plant. Try to make sure that's going to be about 2 inches above the soil level. Fill in around the root ball, firm that down with your hand. And really important, water that plant right as you put it into the ground to really establish the connection between the roots and the water in the soil to make sure we can kind of minimize the shock of being moved out of that container and into our soil. For bare root roses, just remove them from the wrapper, put them in a bucket of water. We don't want them to dry out. Dig a hole in a really well prepared bed, as deep and as wide as the root system is going to be. And like you would do with other bare root plants, you want to build up a mound in the base of that hole that's going to serve as a support for that plant, and spread the root system out around that mound kind of as evenly as we can. Hold that plant in place. Find it very useful to have a little bit of assistance when I do that, but you can certainly do it with one hand. Make sure, again, that graft union is about 2 inches above the soil, and push the rest of the soil in, firm it down, and again, make sure that we're giving it some good water to help it establish in the soil. Fertilization for roses, I have to go back to my standard answer on fertilization. And really that is that there's nothing better to do than to get a soil test and to follow the directions that we get on that soil test. That's going to make sure that the roses have exactly the right nutrient conditions that they need to grow actively and prolifically in our landscape. Roses, you again want to wait until you start to see the initiation of growth in order to fertilize. Very often with roses, we will be fertilizing maybe every month to every month and a half throughout the growing season to sustain good growth. But we're going to back off fertilization as we get to the end of August, as we don't want that new growth as we're starting to get into some colder temperatures, because that new growth can be really susceptible to damage from the cold, and we don't want it to get set back because of that. Again, whenever you fertilize, if you fertilize around the top of the soil, it is a good idea to water that fertilizer in, just as a way to make sure it starts getting down into the root system. I try to plan for a day right before it rains and let the rain do that for me. That's just a personal thing. Again, do water your newly planted roses really thoroughly. Just give them a good drenching of water when you put them in. You really want to establish that good connection. Make sure those roots have water in contact with the water that's there in the soil. That's going to make sure that we, again, minimize the shock that they're going to have as we get them into the ground. As I mentioned, roses do not like wet feet, so we don't want to overwater them, but we do want to provide even moisture and make sure that we're giving them enough water so that we don't have drought conditions for them. One thing that's really critical in growing roses, because of some of the foliar diseases that they are susceptible to, overhead watering of roses can be a real problem. It tends to splash that water up onto the leaves, and as the leaves stay wet for a long period of time, we start to see some of those foliar diseases showing up. So it is absolutely worthwhile for your roses to consider a drip irrigation system. Relatively easy to establish. You can go back and check the video we have for that and for some good directions and just kind of how to get started with that. But those drip irrigation systems are going to be really successful at providing an even watering to the plant that's going to avoid splashing that water up and potentially making some of those disease issues a little bit worse. And now sort of the bare issue for roses is pruning. And I'm going to start with the proviso that pruning is going to be slightly different dependent upon the type of rose that we're talking about. So this is a general commentary, and we may need to just have an entire presentation just talking about pruning of roses, because again, you might approach different kinds of roses a little bit differently. Just really most of our garden roses are going to need to be pruned just in order to maintain the growth habit that we want for them, to keep them to the shape that we want, and to keep them really actively flowering. So generally speaking, when we're talking about at least the heavy pruning for roses, we're going to be doing that somewhere between mid-February if you're down here in the southern part of the state, a little bit later if you're up in the north, so into as far as, as much as mid-March. And keep in mind that is for repeated bloomers. The spring blooming plants, the ones that don't repeatedly bloom throughout the year, we only want to prune those after they have bloomed, because they're blooming on 1 year old wood. So if we prune them before they bloom, unfortunately, we may not see flowers for that year. So for the reblooming varieties, we could do that in the late winter or very early spring. For those spring blooming varieties, we want to wait until we've had the benefit of those flowers to do our pruning. Now, the first thing we want to make sure we do when we prune is we want to thoroughly check the plant, look at all the branches, all of the canes on that plant, and check for any areas where we may see damage. It's possible that we have a cane that's cracked or broken, or in my case, suffering from weed eater disease. And if it's diseased or damaged, we can go ahead and prune that out. It's just not going to be healthy, so we want to get it away from the rest of the plant. We also want to prune out, make sure that we're opening the plant up, getting an increased air circulation. That's going to help us, fit the space, make sure we're reducing disease. You can kind of see, an example down in the bottom image on this slide. You see that unpruned and then the pruned version. You can see how much more open that pruned plant is, how much easier it's going to be for air to move through there. After that, we can cut that plant down fairly significantly. Rose regrows very quickly. So generally speaking, we might be removing about half of last year's growth. We also want to look for any thin or weak growth. If it's the size of pencil or less, we can remove that. If we have branches in the center that sort of interior branches that are crossing, we can clean those out. It's really going to help us open up the habit of the plant. We also want to look down at the bottom and see if we have any suckers coming up from the root. Again, most roses are going to be grafted. So if we have suckers coming up from the rootstock, we want to get rid of those, because they're not going to be the plant that we really like to have there in our landscape. So that's sort of the general process of pruning for that early sort of hard pruning that we can do with roses. One of the great things about roses, and I think what saved me as an 8-year-old kid taking care of his stepmother's roses, is that roses can be pretty forgiving. They grow back very well from these severe pruning. Now, one thing I do want to mention, just kind of to do with this pruning as well, is where we make that cut and make that pruning cut is going to be pretty important in terms of the health of the plant. And you can see the top image here that you're cutting ideally to a bud that's facing outwards, sort of out from the plant, so it's going to grow further outward. But you want to make sure that you cut at a good height above that final bud that you want to cut at. And you can see on that first image, they've cut too high above that bud. That's going to leave a little stub there. It can be a place sort of inviting disease to come in and cause damage. On the second image there, they've cut far too close to the bud. And as a result of that, that bud can dry out and die. And that's not going to, of course, it's not going to grow if that bud dries out. But sort of that last image, or the image that's furthest right there, shows you a good, correct cut. That cut is right about 35 or 45 degrees. It's at a good height above that bud, so that bud's going to be able to get all the water it needs, and it will produce well. And just again, it's better to have it facing outwards because we want that plant to sort of branch outward and grow outward rather than trying to grow back inward. The other type of pruning that we do with roses is called deadheading. You might call it summer pruning as well. Really what we're doing here is removing spent blossoms after the blooming cycle has declined. So after the flowers just aren't looking pretty anymore, we can remove those flowers. And what we're doing by deadheading is we are taking that flower away. So we're removing the requirement that the plant puts that energy into seed production, which is again sort of the end of the start the formation of the fruit for the rose, and putting that back into more growth and potentially more flowers that we can see in the growing season. Now, as I mentioned, for some of the shrub roses, some rose varieties, the hips, or the fruit of the plant, is an attractive feature. And if you do want to see that development of those rose hips, or if you're looking to harvest them to use them, I understand they're quite high in vitamin C. Then you don't want to remove the flowers. You don't want to deadhead because you're removing the potential for those fruit to form, or the hips to form. When you deadhead, again, the flowers starting to decline, you want to cut back to a strong bud, just like you saw sort of in the image previously. And you don't want to remove any more leaves than you absolutely have to. So on the shoot of the plant, you want to remember to leave at least 2 5-leaflet leaves on the shoot. So as the shoot comes out, you see a really good image that I shamelessly stole off the internet. Down there on the bottom, you can see the two leaves there cutting above that at a good strong bud and removing that declining flower. Some advantages of deadheading is that it can keep the canes from getting too leggy. It can keep the excess growth down. You do want to keep in mind that we do want to stop pruning in the early fall because we don't want the plant going into winter with tender new growth that might potentially cause us problems with, again, the plant can get cold damage and that new growth is a lot more susceptible to it. There are self-cleaning varieties of rose that don't require being deadheaded. So keep that in mind that you are going to see some variation in terms of what variety you're working with. So I said I was going to talk about insects and diseases. I'm going to go ahead and get into that. Very common problem we run into with roses are aphids. Fortunately, one of my images is not showing up here. That's okay. You can see the picture there of the aphids themselves. You tend to find these on the underside of leaves. They're a soft-bodied insect with a piercing, sucking mouthpart. One of the things that can be an issue with aphids and some of the other insects we'll talk about is that they release that liquid or honeydew sugary solution that can lead to the formation of sooty mold on the plant. So the leaves all have this black substance on them. Fortunately, aphids are relatively easy to control with neem oil or insecticidal soap. You just need to be very thorough with your application and make sure you target on the underside of leaves, because if you leave any of the aphids there, those infestations can not only build quickly, but rebound from treatment very quickly, and you can have your aphid problem all over again. As with a lot of the insects we're going to talk about, imidacloprid is a common drench insecticide that's used for a lot of the piercing, sucking type insect pests that you might use might have on ornamental plants, and that can be very effective at getting rid of this kind of pest. Whiteflies, again, it seems I have some image issues on here. Really small insects feed very similarly to how aphids do. Often show up on the underside of leaves. They produce that same honeydew that leads to sooty mold on the plant. And you treat them very much the same in terms of how you get rid of them by applying either neem oil or insecticidal soap. The adults continue to lay eggs, so you are going to need to have more than one application of either of these insecticides to make sure that you get effective control. My slide here says 2 applications 5 days apart. You may very well go on to make a 3rd application just to make sure that you've effectively gotten rid of the immature whiteflies that are really what you're trying to get with the insecticide here, because the adults are so mobile that trying to spray them can be very difficult. Thrips are a very small insect, about 1/16 of an inch long or smaller. We've mentioned before, you can sample for thrips by tapping the plant out onto an index card and looking for those really, really small insects moving around. The primary thrips that we deal with are the flower thrips. There's the western flower thrips and several others. They do have a presence for feeding on the flower, and that can really make the appearance of the flowers decline, get spotty, and can also distort the growth of new leaves. Foliar sprays with an insecticide called spinosad are pretty effective for controlling thrips. Some formulations of spinosad are organic, some are not. So if you're concerned about that, you need to make sure that the formulation you're using is an organic one. Insecticidal soaps and horticultural oils can also be effective as long as you get really good coverage. And very similarly, you can use imidacloprid as a soil drench insecticide for thrips control. Spider mites, really, really small, not technically an insect, it's a mite. Feed on the underside of leaves, leading to a stippled appearance. Really heavy infestations are going to show that fine webbing over the plant. And sometimes we do see outbreaks of spider mites after we've applied something like a permethrin type insecticide. So any permethrin or pyrethrin or quite a few others, or carbaryl, which is what 7 insecticide used to be. And because those insecticides kill off some beneficial mites to keep the populations down, and then the spider mite population will increase very quickly. Horticultural oils can be used for these. It can be kind of difficult to treat, but horticultural oil is probably going to be the best thing that a homeowner is going to be able to use. There are some miticides that are available for use commercially, but most of those are not available for homeowners to use. And resistance develops very quickly when you're using those miticides. And so they're not really a good option for most homeowners. Scale insects, you may be familiar with from a variety of other plants. The adult stage is kind of glued down, particularly armored scale is going to be more common on roses than a soft scale would be. You want to check over plants, try to avoid introducing them into your landscape. And again, this is something that can be treated with horticulture oil. It can be a little bit frustrating because you're trying to treat for that crawler stage or the immature stage that's running around on the plant. And so you will again have to treat several times to get effective control. And what you really want to look for, because the scale is glued down to the plant, so even after it's gone, it may still just kind of be stuck there. Really look at new growth and see if you have any scale there, because that's the first place you're going to see if your control is effective. Leaf hoppers, not really a serious problem, but you will occasionally see them causing leaves to get spotted or turn yellow if you have a whole bunch of them. Relatively easy to control with permethrin, but not a very common problem, and not a really serious problem for roses for the most part. Oh, that's terrible. Sorry about that. Cucumber beetles, and specifically the 12-spotted cucumber beetle. You can see an image of it there. Really kind of shiny, greenish yellow with those black spots on the wings. Damage roses by feeding on the petals. Generally speaking, not terribly damaged, terribly damaging alone, but you may have large numbers of them, and that can lead to some serious issues, just kind of a decline in appearance. Relatively easy to control with either permethrin or spinosad as an effective way to get rid of them. Japanese beetle, kind of depends on where you're at, whether this is a big problem or not. They can build large numbers. Relatively easy to identify because they have that nice shiny metallic green kind of copper color to them, and the white tufts of hair around the outside of their abdomen. They can be very important defoliating pests and feed on the flowers. They don't occur everywhere, which is fortunate. I don't see them very much down here, which is something that I'm very happy about. If you just have small numbers of them, it is perfectly okay to just hand pick them off of the plant and throw them into a bucket of soapy water or something like that. It can be frustrating or difficult to do if you have large numbers of plants to work with. So you can spray permethrin insecticides for their control as well. Do occasionally get caterpillars or sawflies that'll feed on the leaves. Sometimes they will roll leaves as well. Sawflies are actually the immature stage of a type of wasp. Caterpillars, of course, are the immature stage for moths and butterflies. There are several different species of each. They all kind of feed the same way, defoliating the plant, sometimes sort of skeletonizing it. It just means they're completely eating all of the leaf, just leaving the veins behind. Small caterpillars are really effectively controlled by BT insecticide, but you really want to focus on just the really small ones. As they get larger, they're harder to control with that product. And then permethrin and spinosad work very well for sort of all cases. The last insect I'm going to mention, occasionally an issue, but one that I encourage people to leave alone. This is the leaf cutter bee, doing just what it says it's doing. They nest solitarily, and they make their nest out of the cut sections of the leaf, which, while I understand that can be frustrating, I actually think it looks kind of neat. Um, they're using that as food for their developing larvae, and they don't tend to do a whole lot of damage. But if you see those really neat semicircles cut out of your rose plant, what you're looking for is a bee that's coming along and making those really neat, clean cuts. Just if I'm going to mention a few diseases that may be something you see on your rose plants. Black spot is absolutely the most common disease of roses. I very rarely see a rose planting that doesn't have black spot to some degree. And like all diseases, one of the most important things we can do is to select for resistant varieties. Some varieties are going to be much, much more affected by this than others. It's most severe on those hybrid tea roses. So that would be a good example of a plant that is going to be more susceptible and have more issues. And you really need to have a management plan in place to make sure this doesn't become a severe problem. So what you get are those big black marks on the leaf. Those leaves tend to turn yellow or chlorotic, and then they will fall off the plant. And sort of the cycle of the disease is then in the following season, when the plant is leafing out again, those leaves that fall on the ground will serve as a way for that fungal pathogen to be splashed back up onto the plant and begin the whole cycle over again. So cleaning up those leaves is an important way that we can interrupt the disease cycle. Pruning before that new growth starts in the spring can also remove any of that tissue that's infested or infected away from the new growth, and get rid of any old mulch that's around the plant, because that may have that disease or that pathogen in there as well. And of course, fungicides can be important. Fungicides like chlorothalonil or myclobutanil can be used for control of black spot. Cercospora is the other very common leaf spot that you may get on roses. It can defoliate some, particularly those that are not very likely to get black spot. And it's really kind of easy to identify because of that light pink to purplish spot with a gray center. Makes it very easy to figure out that that's what's going on. See some really characteristic pictures there on the side. And the management for this is going to be essentially exactly what we would do for black spot. Really encourage sanitation and good pruning practices to be your best shot for getting good management of this pathogen. Very seriously, there's stem canker and dieback. Canker is like a sore on the stem or the cane of the plant. There's several different fungi that can cause this, and they block the flow of water and nutrients up the plant. If it goes all the way around the stem, that's going to block off all of those water and nutrients, and that cane above that canker is going to die. So we want to make sure that we select only disease-free plants, make sure we're not introducing it in. And very importantly, if you see one of these cankers or black areas on the stem like that, we want to prune that away as fast as possible, well below the canker, about 5 inches down. Look at that new cut wood, make sure there's no discoloration inside that cane. If we see more discoloration, we want to cut lower and then remove and destroy that cane. So we don't want to let that reinfest our plants. You will occasionally get stem canker low down on the plant we really want to avoid that canker from progressing down to where the graft union is, because that will very likely lead to the death of the plant. And after we prune away that infected tissue, it's a good idea to treat with a fungicide like mancozeb or chlorothalonil as an effective way to help prevent any further damage to the plant. Powdery mildew, it is named very appropriately for its symptom. We get that white powdery growth on the surface of leaves, on the stems. It can cause some leaf curling like you see down in that bottom image. You may see some red to purple coloration. And we do see this on older roses more than we see on some of the newer types. Important to use sanitation. And there are some fungicides that are mentioned there, like myclobutanil, chlorothalonil, and thiophanate methyl, that can be used for chemical control of powdery mildew. One thing that is useful for a lot of diseases and for some insect pests like whiteflies and thrips and scale is using a dormant spray. So in this case, for a dormant spray for powdery mildew, using a lime sulfur solution can be effective, and it's really just what it sounds like. It's a mixture of lime and sulfur. You can purchase that at many garden stores. It's really effective as a dormant spray as we get into maybe early February or mid-February in the northern range of who I'm talking to, as a way to prevent some of these problems as we get into the new season. Gray mold, also referred to as botrytis mold for the name of the fungus involved. Tend to see this on old buds and blossoms. Start off as a kind of a grayish black lesion that extends down to the cane. And as the weather gets humid, or if we have a really warm, wet period, we might see gray fungus covering over the parts of the plant that are infected. Again, you want to prune that out. And generally, the infections tend to kind of run their course after a couple of weeks, and sort of the situation gets better. But if you don't see that problem resolving, the same sorts of fungicides I've mentioned previously can be applied for help managing gray mold. The water molds, including both Pythium and downy mildew, both of them are really favored by excess water in the soil or damp environments. Excess shade can be a serious issue that kind of helps these problems develop. Very difficult to manage. Pythium is going to be attacking the roots, causing the roots to die back. You can actually take the root and pull the structure of the root away from the little central core or steel of the center of that root. And oftentimes the plant is going to look like it's water stressed or nutrient deficient because the root system is being severely damaged. Downy mildew, you're going to wind up with small red lesions on the cane and on the flowers, on the leaves. Tend to see them between the veins of the leaves. They'll spread out after that. And oftentimes you'll get leaves falling from the plant. Sanitation and maintaining proper soil moisture are absolutely the most important things we can do in order to protect from these particular diseases. Crown gall is an interesting one. It's a bacterial disease caused by a bacterium called Agrobacterium tumefaciens. Causes that big gall that you see down there in that bottom issue or bottom picture. Easily spread by infected wood or by gardening equipment, so it's important to clean and disinfect all your garden equipment. Generally speaking, it's going to cause the plant to get stunted. It's not going to blossom or produce leaves like we'd want it to. And really what we need to do is any infected plant needs to be removed because there's really not a cure we can apply for this. And it can stay in the soil. So replanting in that same area can be really difficult it's because that bacterium may be still in the soil and can reinfest a new plant that you put in. The last disease I'm going to mention before I go on to happier things is rose rosette. Fortunately, down here in the southern part of the state, we do not see, or we have not seen a lot of this. Um, Particularly very damaging. It's a virus disease, so there really is no treatment other than prevention. It's a severe problem on knockout roses, and it's moved place to place by a kind of mite, a very, very, very tiny mite called an eriophid mite. And the symptoms can be a little bit variable depending on what we're looking at. But generally speaking, you're going to have this proliferation of shoots that we call witch's broom. You can see that red coloration of the leaves. And often the nodes will be really short, so the plant will look really bunchy. And if you do see this, you just want to make sure that you remove that plant from your landscape, because all it's going to do is serve as a potential way for more of your plants to get infested. So ideally, if you do see the symptoms of rose rosette, you're just going to want to remove that plant. So I know this slide says questions, and I'm just going to say one more thing, because one thing that's really interesting, since I have become involved in horticulture, is as I travel, I'm always fascinated by public gardens, and there are a wealth of public rose gardens that you can go and visit, and I encourage you to do that. If you're down here in South Mississippi, you should absolutely come by the South Mississippi Branch Experiment Station in Poplarville. They have some fantastic roses along with other plants there that are just really great to look at. But no matter where you travel in the world, there are rose gardens that are absolutely gorgeous that you can go and see. Up in the top left there, that is the Princess Grace Rose Garden in Monaco. Below that on the left, those are gardens in Tralee, Ireland. They have a big festival every year called the Rose of Tralee. The center there is a garden in Buenos Aires. Over on the top right is a garden in Rome. I am going to spare us all my mispronunciation of that. And so in the bottom picture there, in the bottom right, is the Sakura Garden near Tokyo. So wherever you're traveling in the world, I encourage you to get out and look for some of these gardens. There are memorial gardens and botanical gardens and just community gardens and public gardens all over the world. If you're in Louisiana and you haven't been by the Burden Garden, I really encourage you to do that. Just a wonderful place you can get out. Not only can you enjoy the roses, you can enjoy them, and they can do all the hard work of keeping them attractive. So thank you again. If you're watching on YouTube, if you have any questions, please put those down in the comment section, and I will be happy to get that. But with that, I am going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and be happy to answer any questions that anyone might have.